Section 1. The weight of the pen felt heavier than it should have. Sophia sat across from Lucas Blackwood, the billionaire whose name alone sent whispers through high society. His gaze remained impassive, cold, unreadable. The contract lay between them on the mahogany table, its crisp pages spelling out the terms of their arrangement. 1 year. No questions, no expectations of love. Sophia's hands trembled as she flipped to the last page where her signature was required. She could feel Lucas's presence, a force of quiet dominance, but he remained silent, waiting. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. This is the only way, Sophia. Marry him, and our debts disappear. Marry him, and you'll save us all. She had spent her entire life watching her family struggle, watching her father's business crumble under the weight of bad deals and unfortunate circumstances. When Lucas Blackwood made his offer, marry him in exchange for financial security, it wasn't just an easy decision. It was the only decision. Taking a deep breath, she picked up the pen and signed her name. The deal was done. Lucas reached for the contract, his fingers brushing against hers for the briefest second before he pulled away. His dark eyes flickered with something unreadable, but he gave her a curt nod. Welcome to your new life, Mrs. Blackwood. The wedding was a spectacle. Lucas spared no expense, ensuring the world saw them as the perfect couple. Photographers captured the moment she walked down the aisle in a gown worth more than everything her family owned combined. Guests whispered about the suddenness of the union, but no one dared question a man like Lucas Blackwood. Sophia played her part well. She smiled, posed for photos, and let herself be swept into the fairy tale, if only for a night. But reality struck hard the moment the doors of the penthouse closed behind them. Lucas loosened his tie, his expression shifting from the charming groom to the detached businessman. You'll have everything you need, he said, pouring himself a drink. A separate bedroom, unlimited funds, and your family's debts are already settled. Sophia swallowed, gripping the edge of her dress. And in return, you show up when necessary, attend social events as my wife, and keep the press from questioning our marriage. He met her gaze. We don't have to pretend behind closed doors. A hollow ache settled in her chest. She had known this wasn't real. She had told herself 1,000 times that love wasn't part of the equation, but hearing it said so plainly still hurt. Understood, she said, her voice steady. Lucas nodded, seemingly satisfied. Good. Then, without another word, he disappeared into his room, leaving her alone in their extravagant prison. Days turned into weeks, and Sophia learned to navigate the life of Mrs. Blackwood. She attended charity galas, smiled for the cameras, and played the role of the perfect billionaire's wife. The world envied her, but none of them knew the truth. At home, they were strangers. Lucas was always working, buried in meetings and business deals. He came home late, sometimes not at all, and when they did speak, it was only for necessities. Yet, despite his cold demeanor, there were moments when she saw something else in him. The way his gaze lingered on her, when he thought she wasn't looking. The way his jaw clenched whenever another man tried to get too close to her at events. The way his hands brushed against hers when he pulled out a chair for her at dinner. Little things, insignificant things, and yet they made her heart betray her. She wasn't supposed to feel this way. She wasn't supposed to fall. It happened slowly, almost without her realizing it. One night, Lucas came home earlier than usual, exhaustion weighing heavy on his features. Without thinking, she poured him a glass of whiskey and set it in front of him. He looked at her, surprised. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know. A beat of silence stretched between them. Then, for the first time since their wedding, Lucas sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Today was a disaster. Sophia hesitated. Do you want to talk about it? He scoffed, shaking his head. No one ever asks me that. It wasn't an answer, but it was enough. That night, for the first time, they sat together. Just two people, not a billionaire and his contract wife, and it was the beginning of something neither of them were ready for. Sophia started noticing more about Lucas. He wasn't just a ruthless businessman. Beneath the cold exterior was a man who carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders, a man who never let himself slow down, who never let himself be vulnerable. And maybe, just maybe, she was the only one who saw it. She didn't realize how deeply she had fallen until one fateful night. Lucas had an important gala to attend, but he never showed. Worried, Sophia searched the penthouse and found him in his study, sitting in the dark, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand. "Lucas," she whispered, stepping inside. He didn't look at her. "My father built this company," he murmured. "He made it into what it is today. And now I have to prove I can keep it from falling apart." Sophia's chest tightened. She had never heard him speak about his father before. Gently, she walked over and knelt beside his chair. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly. Lucas turned to her, his expression unreadable. And then he cupped her face and kissed her. It wasn't part of their deal. It wasn't something either of them had planned. But it changed everything. Sophia barely slept that night. She told herself it was a mistake, that it meant nothing. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had fallen for her husband. And she was about to learn the most painful lesson of all. Lucas Blackwood never intended to stay married. I'll now write section 2 with 1,500 plus words while maintaining the established tone and flow. Section 2. Sophia should have known better. Falling in love with Lucas Blackwood was never part of the plan. Yet here she was, lying awake in bed, her heart pounding as the memory of his lips against hers replayed in her mind. It had been a mistake, a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment. And yet, she touched her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss. What did it mean? Had it been a mistake for him too? Or had Lucas felt something, anything, when he kissed her? Sophia groaned, turning onto her side, willing herself to sleep. But she already knew the answer. Lucas Blackwood didn't fall in love. This was just a game to him, and she was the fool who had started playing without realizing the rules. The next morning, Sophia tried to act normal. She walked into the dining room expecting Lucas to be gone already, as he usually was. But to her surprise, he was there, sipping his coffee, reading the newspaper like it was just another day, like last night hadn't happened. Her heart clenched. He wasn't going to mention it. Of course he wasn't. "Good morning," she said, forcing her voice to sound casual. Lucas glanced up, his expression unreadable. Morning. That was it. No hesitation, no tension, no indication that he'd spent the night thinking about that kiss like she had. She swallowed hard and sat across from him. The silence stretched. She should have been relieved that he wasn't making things awkward. Instead, it hurt. He really didn't care. Lucas folded his newspaper and took another sip of coffee. "I have a business trip this weekend." Sophia blinked, caught off guard by the sudden change of topic. "Oh, I'll be gone for a few days." He stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "You don't have to attend any events while I'm away. Take the weekend off." The way he said it, so detached, so indifferent, made something inside her snap. Take the weekend off, like she was just an employee, like last night had never happened. "Right, of course," she forced a smile. "Safe travels." Lucas gave her a nod, then walked away, leaving her alone at the table. And that was the moment she knew. No matter how much she wanted to believe otherwise, she was nothing more than a contract wife to him. Nothing more, nothing less. And it was time she started acting like it. With Lucas gone, Sophia finally allowed herself to breathe. She had spent so much time trying to play the role of Mrs. Blackwood, smiling at galas, dressing the part, making sure she never embarrassed him in public. But now, for the first time in months, she didn't have to pretend. She spent the weekend doing things she hadn't done in ages. She walked through Central Park, enjoying the crisp autumn air. She visited her father's old bookstore, which she had fought so hard to save with this marriage. She even had lunch at a quiet cafe, relishing the simple pleasure of eating alone without paparazzi watching her every move. It was nice and peaceful, and it made her realize something. She missed being Sophia. Not Sophia Blackwood, the billionaire's wife. Just Sophia. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start thinking about who she wanted to be when this marriage was over. Because it would be over. She had to accept that, no matter how much her heart wanted otherwise. When Lucas returned from his trip, something had changed. Not in him, in her. She no longer waited for him at dinner, no longer tried to fill the silence between them. She no longer searched his face for signs that he felt something for her. She simply existed. And for the first time since their wedding, Lucas noticed. He came home one evening to find Sophia curled up on the couch, reading a book, completely unaware of his presence. Usually she would greet him. Usually she would ask about his day, but this time, she didn't even look up. Lucas frowned. "Sophia." She finally glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Oh, you're back." That was it. No warmth, no excitement. Lucas wasn't sure why it bothered him. "Did something happen?" he asked, loosening his tie. Sophia shut her book, setting it aside. No. Silence. He studied her, trying to figure out what was different, but he couldn't, and it frustrated him. I thought we could have dinner together, he said finally. Sophia blinked, surprised. They never had dinner together unless it was for an event. She hesitated. I already ate. Another first. Lucas clenched his jaw. Something had changed, and he wasn't sure he liked it. For the next week, the shift between them only became more obvious. Sophia stopped waiting for him, stopped trying to engage him in conversation, stopped acting like she cared. And Lucas? He noticed everything. The way she no longer laughed at his dry humor. The way she no longer reached for him absent-mindedly. The way she started going out more, spending time in places that weren't their penthouse. She was pulling away, and he had no idea why it bothered him so much. Lucas Blackwood wasn't the type to chase. He had never needed to. Women threw themselves at him. They wanted his wealth, his status, his name. But Sophia, she didn't seem to want anything from him anymore. And for the first time in his life, Lucas felt uneasy. One night he found himself waiting for her. She had gone out earlier that evening, and it was nearing midnight. She still wasn't home. Lucas checked his watch, irritation prickling under his skin. Where the hell was she? He tried to ignore it, tried to remind himself that it didn't matter, that this wasn't a real marriage, that Sophia was free to do whatever she wanted, and yet, when he finally heard the penthouse door open, he was on his feet before he could stop himself. Sophia stepped inside, pausing when she saw him. Lucas? She said, surprised. You're still awake? He crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. Where were you? She raised an eyebrow. Out. That's not an answer. She sighed, setting down her purse. I had dinner with a friend. Lucas's jaw tightened. A friend? Yes. Silence. Lucas's grip on his arms tightened. A man. Sophia's lips curled into something almost amused. Would it matter if it was? Something sharp twisted in his chest. He didn't like this, didn't like the idea of her with someone else. Didn't like the way she was looking at him now, calm, detached, as if she had already decided he didn't matter. Lucas clenched his jaw. Get some rest, he said stiffly, turning away. It's late. And then he walked out, because for the first time in his life, Lucas Blackwood didn't have control over something, and he hated it. Section 3. Lucas Blackwood had never been ignored before. It was a strange, foreign feeling, one that settled uncomfortably in his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. For months, Sophia had been present in his life in ways he hadn't expected. She had smiled at him, spoken to him with warmth, tried to make their marriage feel real. And now she was acting like he was a stranger. It shouldn't have mattered. After all, wasn't this what he had wanted? A convenient marriage without complications, without emotions? Then why did it bother him so much to watch her slip away? Why did he find himself lingering in rooms longer than necessary, just to see if she'd acknowledge him? Why did he feel an unfamiliar pang of irritation every time she left the penthouse, only to return hours later, looking refreshed and content, like she didn't even miss him? Lucas didn't do emotions, but this felt like something, and he didn't like it. Sophia, on the other hand, was learning to breathe again. At first, she had forced herself to step back. She had spent too long chasing after a man who didn't want to be caught, too long waiting for a sign that Lucas felt even a fraction of what she felt. But now she was reclaiming herself. She went to art exhibits, explored the city, reconnected with old friends she had lost touch with after her marriage. She started painting again, something she hadn't done in years. She even stopped checking her phone, waiting for a message from Lucas. And the strangest part? It felt good. It felt freeing. For the first time in months, she wasn't living her life around Lucas Blackwood. And she realized something. She had been lonely in this marriage. She had convinced herself that if she was patient, if she just waited long enough, Lucas would soften, that he would see her, really see her, and maybe, just maybe, this marriage would turn into something real. But she wasn't going to wait anymore, because if there was one thing Lucas Blackwood had taught her, it was that waiting for someone to care was a waste of time. Lucas noticed the change before he was ready to admit it. Sophia had stopped chasing him, and somehow that made him want to chase her. He found himself watching her more, noticing things he had ignored before. The way she hummed softly when she cooked in the kitchen, completely unaware of his presence. The way her eyes sparkled when she spoke to someone on the phone, laughing at something he wasn't a part of. The way she had started living without him. It unsettled him. More than that, it irritated him. Because it wasn't supposed to be this way. He had always assumed that when their contract ended, Sophia would be the one struggling to walk away. That she would be the one wanting more. But now he wasn't so sure. And that realization did something to him. Something dangerous and something that made him want. One night, Lucas came home to find Sophia on the balcony, a glass of wine in hand looking out over the city. She didn't turn when he stepped outside. Didn't acknowledge him at all. That shouldn't have annoyed him, but it did. He cleared his throat. "You've been going out a lot lately." Sophia took a slow sip of her wine. Yes, that was it. No explanation, no guilt. Lucas's jaw tightened. "Where do you go?" She finally turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "Out." Something sharp twisted in his chest. This wasn't the Sophia he had married. This wasn't the woman who used to hang on to his every word, waiting for scraps of attention. This was someone else. Someone he was suddenly terrified of losing. "You're different," he said, studying her. A small, almost amused smile touched her lips. "No, Lucas. I'm just not waiting around for you anymore." She turned back to the city, her meaning clear. This conversation was over, and for the first time in his life, Lucas didn't know what to do next. Section 4. Lucas Blackwood had always prided himself on control. Control over his emotions, control over his business, and control over his life. His marriage to Sophia had been part of that control, a calculated move to secure his future and protect his assets. It was never supposed to be complicated. But lately, everything about Sophia was throwing him off balance. She had changed, or perhaps he realized she had always been this way, and he had been too blind to see it. She no longer lingered around him, waiting for his attention, no longer looked at him with those hopeful, searching eyes, no longer made any effort to be in his world, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. At first, he had told himself it was a relief, that it was better this way, that it was inevitable. Their marriage had an expiration date after all, but the longer he watched her slip away, the harder it became to ignore the quiet ache forming in his chest. The worst part? He didn't know how to stop it. Sophia, on the other hand, had found something she hadn't realized she was missing. Herself. For so long she had been waiting for Lucas to see her, waiting for him to care, waiting for a moment that would never come. So she stopped waiting. She spent her days outside the mansion now, rediscovering the things she had loved before her world had been swallowed up by Lucas Blackwood's name. She spent her mornings at a little bookstore downtown, where the owner, a kind elderly woman named Margaret, always set aside her favorite poetry collections. She took long walks through Central Park, breathing in the crisp autumn air, savoring the feeling of freedom. She started painting again, something she had abandoned when she married Lucas, too consumed with trying to fit into his world. And most importantly, she stopped thinking about what Lucas was doing. She stopped wondering where he was or if he even noticed her absence, because she had finally come to terms with the truth. She was never part of his world to begin with. But Lucas did notice. At first it was subtle. Sophia's absence at the dinner table, the quiet in their home, the way the air felt empty when she wasn't in the room. But then it became obvious. She didn't wait for him to come home anymore. Didn't ask him how his day was. Didn't even glance in his direction when they happened to cross paths in the house. She was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know how to stop it. Lucas Blackwood was not a man who begged. He was not a man who chased. But with every passing day, he found himself staring at the door, waiting for her to walk through it. And when she didn't, something inside him twisted. One night he came home earlier than usual. He didn't know why. Normally, he worked late, preferring the solitude of his office over the suffocating silence of their house. But something had pulled him home that night, and when he arrived, he found the house empty. Sophia wasn't there. For a brief moment, panic flickered in his chest. Was she with someone else? Had she already moved on? The thought of another man making her smile, making her laugh, sent a sharp, unfamiliar sting through him. He grabbed his phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing her number. It rang and rang and rang, until finally her voice answered, soft and distant. "Lucas?" He swallowed, suddenly unsure of what to say. "Where are you?" His voice came out sharper than he intended. There was a pause. "Out." The single word made his grip tighten on the phone. With who? Another pause, this one longer. Does it matter? Yes, it mattered more than he could explain, but he couldn't say that. So instead, he forced his voice into something cold and detached. Just be careful. Then he hung up before she could say anything else. And for the first time in his life, Lucas Blackwood felt powerless. Sophia stared at her phone after the call ended, a strange feeling twisting in her chest. She hadn't expected him to call, hadn't expected him to care, and maybe he still didn't. Maybe it was just his pride, his possessiveness. Maybe he didn't like the idea of her being out of his control. But for a brief second just before he hung up, she had heard something in his voice. Something almost desperate. She shook the thought away. It didn't matter. Lucas had made it clear where she stood in his life. She wasn't going to let herself hope again, not when she had finally started to move forward. And so, she slipped her phone back into her pocket, turned back to the group of friends she had made at her art class, and forced herself to smile. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just Lucas Blackwood's wife. She was Sophia again, and she wasn't going to let him take that away from her. Lucas, meanwhile, sat in his office staring at the glass of whiskey in his hand. He didn't know what was happening to him, didn't know why the thought of Sophia out there, living her life without him, made him feel like he was unraveling. This was what he had wanted. A marriage of convenience, no messy emotions, no attachments. Then why did it feel like he was losing something irreplaceable? Why did it feel like he had made a terrible mistake? For the first time in his life, Lucas Blackwood realized that power, wealth, and control meant nothing if the one thing he truly wanted was walking away from him. And the worst part? He had no one to blame but himself. Section 5. Sophia spent the next few days trying to decipher the turmoil in her heart. The walls of the Blackwood mansion had never felt so suffocating. She had entered this marriage expecting nothing more than financial security for her family. She had accepted Lucas's coldness, his indifference, and the transactional nature of their arrangement. But now, everything had changed. She had fallen in love with a man who, for all she knew, still viewed her as a mere contract. Her mind was plagued with memories of the past few months. The gentle way Lucas had carried her to bed when she had fallen asleep on the couch. The quiet mornings where they shared coffee in comfortable silence. The way his eyes softened whenever she spoke about something she was passionate about. The way he always pulled her closer in his sleep, even though he never acknowledged it in the morning. It was in the little things that she had seen the man behind the ruthless billionaire facade. She had convinced herself that there was no love in this marriage. Yet here she was, standing on the precipice of heartbreak, terrified that she was the only one who had fallen. And now there was another truth she could no longer ignore. Lucas was keeping something from her. She had sensed it ever since the conversation at the gala. The way he had hesitated when she asked about their future. The way his gaze lingered on her, as if he had something to say but couldn't bring himself to say it. The way his grip on her hand had tightened, as if he were holding on to something, onto her. Sophia had never been one to pry, but this time she had to know the truth. Late that evening, when Lucas left for a business dinner, she decided to look for answers. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped into his home office. She had never invaded his space before, but desperation pushed her forward. If there was anything to uncover, it would be here. The room smelled of leather and expensive cologne. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with everything from legal documents to classic literature. His desk was meticulously organized, a reflection of the man himself. But it wasn't the desk that caught her attention. It was the locked drawer on the side. Lucas had given her full access to the house, but she had never seen him open this particular drawer. If there was something he didn't want her to see, it had to be inside. She hesitated for a moment before pulling open his top drawer, searching for a key. Her fingers brushed against something cold, a spare key tucked beneath a stack of papers. Her hands trembled as she inserted the key into the locked drawer. With a soft click, it opened. Inside, she found a single folder, thick, bound together with a silver clip. The moment she flipped it open, her heart stopped. It was a contract. Their contract, the same one she had signed when she agreed to marry him. Only now, there was an additional page. A divorce agreement already prepared, already signed. And the date. It was marked for their 1-year anniversary. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as her vision blurred. She traced the letters with shaky fingers, unable to process what she was seeing. He had planned everything. Even before they had begun to truly know each other, even before she had fallen for him, he had already decided when this marriage would end. Her entire body trembled as the realization sank in. She had been so naive, so foolish. Lucas had never planned to stay married to her. A wave of nausea rolled through her as she slammed the folder shut. The walls of the office suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. She needed to get out, needed to breathe. She stumbled out of the office and made her way upstairs, her mind spinning. All of it had been a lie. Every stolen glance, every lingering touch, every moment where she thought she had seen something real in his eyes. A cruel joke. By the time Lucas returned home that night, Sophia had locked herself in the guest bedroom. She couldn't face him, not now, not when she was seconds away from breaking. Lucas knocked on the door, his voice filled with concern. "Sophia." She remained silent, gripping the sheets as if they could hold her together. Another knock, a pause, then the sound of retreating footsteps. Only then did she let the tears fall. The next morning, Sophia avoided him. She skipped breakfast, choosing to stay in her room under the pretense of feeling unwell. But she knew she couldn't hide forever. Lucas found her in the garden later that afternoon. "You weren't at breakfast," he said, his voice laced with something she couldn't quite place. Concern? Annoyance? She kept her back to him, watching the wind play with the petals of the white roses. "I wasn't hungry." A silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Lucas sighed and stepped closer. "Did I do something?" Sophia clenched her jaw. "Does it matter?" Lucas frowned, clearly thrown by her sudden coldness. "Of course it matters." She turned then, meeting his gaze, searching for the truth in those deep, unreadable eyes. She wanted to scream at him, to throw the contract in his face and demand an explanation, to ask him why he had been so kind to her when he had planned to leave all along. But she didn't. Instead, she forced a smile. "I just need some time." Lucas studied her for a long moment before nodding. "All right, but if something's wrong, you can tell me." Tell him. The irony of it all nearly made her laugh. She had spent months falling in love with a man who had already decided to let her go. As he walked away, Sophia made a decision. She wasn't going to wait around for Lucas Blackwood to break her heart. She would leave first, and this time she wouldn't look back. That evening, Sophia began to prepare. She couldn't leave immediately. If she did, Lucas would know something was wrong. She needed to be strategic. She started by reaching out to an old friend, Emma Sinclair, a lawyer she had met through mutual acquaintances. "I need your help," Sophia said over the phone, keeping her voice steady. "I need to revise my prenuptial agreement." There was a pause, then, "Are you sure?" Sophia inhaled deeply. "Yes." Emma sighed. "All right, send me the documents and I'll take a look." After hanging up, Sophia retrieved the contract from Lucas's office. This time, she wasn't looking for the divorce agreement. She was looking for something far more important. A loophole. And when she found it, her heart pounded in her chest. Lucas had made one mistake in his carefully crafted plan. He had assumed she wouldn't fight back. But he was wrong, because this time she was the one making the rules. Section 6. Sophia spent the next several days carefully orchestrating her exit. She knew she couldn't leave abruptly. Lucas was too sharp, too perceptive. If she made any sudden moves, he would sense that something was off. So she played her part perfectly, keeping up appearances, smiling at the right moments, nodding during their evening conversations. But deep down, something inside her had shifted. She had loved him, but now she saw the truth. Lucas Blackwood had never planned on staying with her. The divorce agreement had been sitting in his office all along, a reminder that to him, this had always been temporary. He had known exactly when this marriage would end, while she had been foolish enough to believe in something real. But if Lucas thought she was going to wait around for him to discard her like some business deal gone stale, he was wrong. She wasn't the same naive woman who had walked into this marriage for the sake of her family. She was leaving, but first she needed to make sure she left on her terms. Late one evening, Sophia sat in the dimly lit study, staring at the legal documents Emma had sent her. The loophole she had found in their prenuptial agreement was minor, but significant enough to change everything. Lucas's legal team had been thorough, but they had underestimated her. Their contract stipulated that if either party initiated a divorce before the 1-year mark, the other would be entitled to a significant financial settlement. However, There was one condition. The divorce had to be mutual, signed by both parties voluntarily. That meant if Lucas planned to serve her with divorce papers on their anniversary, she had leverage. If she refused to sign, he would be forced to negotiate, and that gave her power. Power she never expected to have. Sophia took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the documents. If she played this right, she wouldn't walk away empty-handed. She would leave on her terms, and Lucas Blackwood would regret ever underestimating her. For the next few days, Sophia carried on as if nothing had changed. She attended charity luncheons, dined with Lucas in the evenings, and played the role of the dutiful wife flawlessly. But beneath the surface, she was preparing her departure. She quietly withdrew money from their shared accounts, nothing significant enough to raise alarms, but enough to ensure she had her own funds once she left. She reached out to a trusted real estate agent under a different name, securing a small penthouse in the city where she could move once everything was finalized. And most importantly, she prepared her own legal documents, because she wasn't just going to leave Lucas. She was going to leave him with nothing. One evening, as they sat across from each other at dinner, Lucas studied her with quiet intensity. "You've been different lately," he said, his voice smooth yet probing. Sophia forced a smile, delicately slicing her steak. "Different how?" Lucas set his glass of whiskey down, watching her carefully. "I don't know. Quieter, like your mind is somewhere else." She met his gaze, her heart pounding. She had spent years studying this man, learning to read every subtle shift in his demeanor. And right now, he was suspicious. She needed to throw him off. "I've just been thinking about the future," she said softly, offering him a small, vulnerable smile. "About us." Lucas's gaze darkened slightly. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "The future, huh?" Sophia nodded. "Yes, I was wondering, do you ever think about what happens after our first year together?" She watched him closely, searching for a reaction. Lucas hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough for her to see the truth written across his face. He had been planning to end things all along. Sophia's stomach twisted, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. Lucas exhaled slowly, setting his drink down. "Sophia." He didn't need to say anything else, she already knew. And that's when she realized something that made her blood run cold. Lucas wasn't struggling with the idea of divorce. He was waiting for it. He had already moved on in his mind, already prepared to cut ties. And in that moment, something inside Sophia hardened. She wouldn't let him see her pain, wouldn't let him see how deeply he had wounded her. Instead, she smiled, reaching for her wine. "Forget it," she said lightly. "It was just a thought." Lucas studied her for a long moment, as if debating whether or not to believe her. Then, after a moment, he nodded, but in his eyes she saw something new, doubt, and that was exactly what she wanted. The final piece of her plan came together the following week. Emma had finalized everything: her own legal documents, a revised settlement, and an airtight agreement that would ensure she walked away with far more than Lucas ever intended. She had officially secured her new home, packed her most valuable belongings, and made sure she had everything she needed. All that was left was the confrontation, and Sophia planned to make it one Lucas Blackwood would never forget. It happened on a Friday evening. Lucas had just arrived home from a long day of meetings, loosening his tie as he stepped into the penthouse. Sophia was already waiting for him in the living room, a sleek envelope resting on the glass coffee table between them. He stopped in his tracks the moment he saw it. Sophia watched him carefully, her heart pounding in her chest. "Sit down, Lucas," she said smoothly, gesturing to the seat across from her. Lucas's eyes narrowed slightly, but he did as she asked. His gaze flickered to the envelope, then back to her. "What's this?" Sophia leaned forward, her fingers tracing the edge of her wine glass. "It's my proposal." Lucas frowned, reaching for the envelope. He pulled out the stack of documents and began flipping through them. And then he froze. His expression darkened as he read through the first few pages, his grip tightening on the paper. "You revised our prenup?" His voice was dangerously low. Sophia tilted her head slightly. "Yes." Lucas's jaw clenched. "Sophia, what the hell is this?" "It's exactly what it looks like," she said, her voice smooth. "A renegotiation of the terms." His eyes burned into hers. "You expect me to agree to this?" Sophia smiled. "No, Lucas, I expect you to sign it." A tense silence stretched between them. Lucas exhaled sharply, tossing the documents onto the table. This isn't what we agreed on. Sophia's expression didn't waver. Neither was falling in love with you. Lucas's entire body stiffened. For the first time since they had met, he was the one caught off guard. She watched as emotions flickered across his face. Confusion, anger, something almost vulnerable. But she didn't wait for him to process it. She rose to her feet, grabbing her coat. "You wanted a contract marriage, Lucas," she said, her voice softer now. "But I didn't agree to be collateral damage." Lucas stared at her, his hands tightening into fists. She grabbed her bag and turned toward the door. "You have until midnight," she said over her shoulder. "If you don't sign, I'll take everything." And with that, she walked out, leaving behind the one man who had never expected to lose her. And for the first time in his life, Lucas Blackwood was afraid. Section 7. Lucas sat frozen in his seat, staring at the door that had just closed behind Sophia. His fingers tightened around the stack of papers she had left on the table, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. She had outmaneuvered him. He had always prided himself on being one step ahead, on controlling every situation, every negotiation. Yet here he was, blindsided by the one person he had never expected to challenge him. Sophia had been playing her own game all along, and now she held all the power. Lucas exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. His pulse pounded in his ears as he flipped through the documents again. His legal team had designed the original prenup to favor him, ensuring that if the marriage ended, he would walk away untouched. But Sophia had rewritten the rules. Her revised agreement gave her far more than what was originally promised: financial assets, property shares, and an ironclad clause preventing him from contesting the terms in court. If he didn't sign by midnight, she had the legal grounds to go after his empire. And the worst part? He had no doubt she would. Lucas clenched his jaw. Damn it. He had underestimated her, dismissed her as the soft-hearted woman who had entered this marriage out of desperation. But she was so much more than that. She had played the long game, and she had won. Lucas wasn't sure if he should be furious or impressed. A slow, bitter smile tugged at the corner of his lips. She had learned well, too well. And for the first time in years, he was the one backed into a corner. Sophia sat in the back of a town car, staring out at the glittering skyline as the city rushed past her. Her hands trembled slightly as she exhaled, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside her. She had done it. After months of careful planning, she had finally turned the tables on Lucas Blackwood. But why did it feel like a hollow victory? She had expected to feel relief, triumph, even satisfaction. But instead, all she felt was a deep, aching sadness, because no matter how much she tried to deny it, she had loved him. She still did, and that was the worst part. Sophia shut her eyes, pressing her fingers against her temples. Number. She refused to dwell on emotions. She had come too far to let herself crumble now. She had a plan, a future, a life without Lucas. She would be free, even if it meant walking away from the only man she had ever truly wanted. Lucas spent the next hour sitting in silence, the weight of his own mistakes crashing down on him. He replayed every moment, every late night working instead of being with her, every cold exchange when she had tried to reach him, every missed opportunity to tell her how he really felt. He had been waiting for this marriage to end, but now that it was happening, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a loss. A sharp knock at the door snapped him from his thoughts. "Come in," he said gruffly. His assistant, Daniel, stepped inside, holding a tablet. "Sir, I received word that Mrs. Blackwood has checked into the Clarendon Hotel under a private reservation." Lucas's jaw tensed. "And?" Daniel hesitated. "She's already begun the process of transferring funds to an account under her name." Lucas let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. She really wasn't playing games. He should have seen it coming. But there was one thing she hadn't accounted for. Lucas wasn't going to let her go. Sophia sat in the penthouse suite of the Clarendon, watching the clock inch toward midnight. The papers were signed on her end. All she needed was Lucas's signature, and then it would be over. Her phone buzzed. "Lucas!" She stared at his name flashing on the screen, her heart pounding. He hadn't tried to call all night, not when she walked out, not when she left the penthouse, not when she sent the final agreement to his office. So why now? Sophia took a deep breath and answered, "Lucas." A heavy silence. Then his voice, low, rough. "Come back." Her throat tightened. I gave you everything you need, just sign. Another pause, then, I don't want to sign. Sophia closed her eyes. Lucas, don't do this. I made a mistake, he said, his voice strained. I should have told you the truth from the beginning. Her fingers curled against her lap. Which truth? That you were planning to end this from the start? That I was just a temporary convenience? I was a coward, he admitted. I thought if I kept my distance, it wouldn't matter when it ended. Sophia's chest ached. And now? Lucas exhaled sharply. Now I know I don't want it to end. Her breath hitched. I don't want the money, the property, the agreements, he said, voice raw. I just want you. A lump formed in her throat. No, he didn't get to do this now. You don't get to say that now, Lucas, she whispered. Not after everything. I know, he said. But I'm saying it anyway. Sophia's grip on the phone tightened. She couldn't let him break her again. Sign the papers, Lucas, she said, her voice shaking. Because I'm not coming back. Silence, then a soft, bitter chuckle. Is that what you really want? But she forced herself to say it. Yes. Another pause, and then, all right. Sophia's heart twisted. Goodbye, Sophia, he said softly. The call ended, and for the first time in months, Sophia felt truly, completely alone. The next morning, the signed papers arrived at her suite. Lucas had let her go, and somehow that hurt more than anything. Section 8. Sophia stared at the envelope in her hands, the weight of its contents pressing against her chest like an anchor. Lucas had signed the divorce papers. The finality of it was suffocating, an unspoken confirmation that this chapter of her life was officially over. It was what she had wanted. So why did it feel like she was standing at the edge of a precipice, staring into the void of something far more painful than she had anticipated? She exhaled slowly and placed the envelope on the table. No more second-guessing, no more wondering what could have been. This was what she had worked toward. Freedom. She turned her focus to what came next. Sophia had already initiated the transfer of assets to her personal accounts. She had arranged for a new apartment in a discreet location, away from the prying eyes of society and the whispers of those who had watched her marriage play out like a carefully curated performance. She had even secured a job with one of Lucas's competitors, a quiet move that would ensure she had financial stability beyond what she had already taken. Everything was in place, and yet the gnawing ache in her chest refused to fade. She reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen before she stopped herself. She couldn't call him. Lucas had let her go, and she needed to do the same. Lucas sat in his office, staring at the empty glass on his desk. The divorce papers had been signed, the ink dried, the deal sealed. Sophia was no longer his wife. She was no longer his anything. He exhaled sharply, his grip tightening around the armrest of his chair. He had spent years believing that control was the only thing that mattered, that emotions were a liability, that attachment led to nothing but weakness. And yet, here he was, feeling the sharp edges of loss in a way he never had before. His assistant entered hesitantly. Sir, the legal team has confirmed the completion of the divorce settlement. Lucas nodded but said nothing. After a moment, the assistant added, Mrs. Blackwood has begun transferring assets to her personal account, and she's taken a position at Sterling and Company. Lucas's gaze snapped up. Sterling? The assistant nodded. Yes, sir, effective immediately. It seems she's moving forward quickly. Lucas let out a humorless chuckle. Of course she was. Sophia had always been decisive when she set her mind to something, and now she had made it clear she was moving on, and he was supposed to do the same. So why did the thought of it make his chest tighten like a vice? He ran a hand down his face, exhaustion seeping into his bones. He had made his choice. He had let her walk away. But deep down, he knew he had made a mistake. Days passed, and Sophia settled into her new life with mechanical precision. She moved into her new apartment, a sleek, modern space that lacked the grandeur of the Blackwood estate but felt like hers. She threw herself into work at Sterling and Company, proving her worth to a company that had once been Lucas's competitor. She was efficient, intelligent, and relentless. She refused to be seen as just a former socialite who had walked away from a billionaire's fortune. She wanted to build something for herself, by herself, and yet no matter how many hours she worked, how many tasks she completed, how many business meetings she attended, she couldn't shake the emptiness that settled in the pit of her stomach. Lucas's presence lingered in ways she hadn't anticipated. It was in the way she reached for her phone late at night, only to stop herself. It was in the way she caught herself remembering small details, the way he liked his coffee, the rare moments when he let his guard down, the way he had looked at her that night when she left. It was in the quiet moments when she admitted to herself what she had been trying to deny all along. She missed him. Lucas found himself drifting through the days, each one blending into the next. He attended meetings, reviewed reports, continued expanding his empire, but none of it felt the same. He had spent years building his company from the ground up, turning it into one of the most powerful enterprises in the country. But now, for the first time, success felt hollow, because Sophia wasn't there to share it. He had underestimated what she meant to him. She had been more than just a convenience, more than just a deal, more than just the woman he had married out of obligation. She had become the one person who challenged him, who saw through his carefully constructed walls, who had the courage to walk away when she realized she deserved better, and he hated that he had given her a reason to. Lucas leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Could he fix this, or had he already lost her for good? Sophia sat at her desk late into the evening, reviewing reports when a soft chime signaled an incoming email. Her breath caught when she saw the sender, Lucas Blackwood. Her fingers hovered over the mouse, her heart hammering in her chest. For a long moment she debated ignoring it, deleting it, forgetting him, but in the end she clicked. His message was brief. Dinner, tomorrow, 8 p.m., no negotiations, no business talk, just us. Sophia's pulse quickened. She stared at the screen, her mind warring with itself. She should decline, she should delete the email and move on. But instead, she found herself typing 3 simple words, "I'll be there." And as she pressed send, she knew this wasn't over. Section 9. Sophia walked into the restaurant with measured steps, her heart pounding against her ribcage despite the calm facade she wore. The atmosphere was elegant, dimly lit with warm candlelight reflecting off the polished marble floors. The scent of aged wine and freshly prepared dishes filled the air, but she barely noticed it. Her mind was too occupied with one thing, Lucas. She had debated not coming. She had spent hours pacing her apartment, convincing herself that she owed him nothing, that meeting him was a mistake, that her life was moving forward, and she had no reason to look back. And yet here she was. A waiter led her toward a secluded booth at the far end of the restaurant, a private corner away from the crowd. Lucas sat there, dressed in a crisp black suit, his expression unreadable. But his eyes, they told a different story. The moment they met hers, something flickered across his face, a mixture of relief, longing, and something deeper, something raw. She steeled herself. This wasn't a reconciliation. This wasn't her walking back into his life, ready to forget everything that had happened. This was closure, at least that's what she told herself. Lucas stood as she approached, his movements slow, calculated. "You came. I'm here," she replied simply, sliding into the seat across from him. The waiter appeared immediately, pouring a glass of wine for each of them before discreetly stepping away. The silence stretched between them, thick and charged, neither one knowing how to begin. Lucas exhaled, leaning forward slightly. "You look good." Sophia arched a brow. "I'm doing well." His lips pressed into a thin line. "I know. I've been keeping track." Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. "Keeping track? I've seen the moves you've made at Sterling and Company. Their stock has risen since you joined. Their market strategies have improved. That's you." She blinked, surprised that he had been paying attention. "You don't have to keep tabs on me, Lucas." "I don't have to," he admitted. "But I do." Silence fell again, and Sophia shifted in her seat, refusing to let herself get drawn into whatever he was trying to say. She took a sip of her wine, letting the flavor settle on her tongue before speaking again. "You asked me to dinner," she said finally, setting her glass down. "So say whatever it is you wanted to say." Lucas studied her for a long moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "I made a mistake." Sophia's breath caught, but she forced herself to remain composed. "You'll have to be more specific than that." His jaw tensed. "Letting you go." She inhaled sharply, her fingers curling around the edge of the table. "Sophia," Lucas continued, his voice lower now, rougher. "I thought I was protecting myself. I thought keeping our marriage business only was the right decision, that it would keep things simple. But I was wrong. I was so—" He exhaled, shaking his head. "I was so wrong." Sophia felt her pulse quicken, but she fought to keep her voice even. And you realize this now? After the papers were signed? Lucas flinched. I realized it the moment you walked away. A bitter smile tugged at her lips. That's convenient. His fingers drummed against the table, a rare show of agitation. I know I don't deserve another chance. I know I hurt you, but I can't let this end like this. I can't let us end like this. Sophia's breath hitched. United States, a word she had tried to erase from her mind, a word that still had too much power over her. She shook her head slowly. You don't get to say that now, Lucas. Not after everything. Not after you made it clear that this marriage was temporary, that you never planned for it to be real. His expression darkened, regret flickering in his eyes. I was a fool. She swallowed, her throat tight. Yes, you were. Lucas exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. Tell me what I can do to fix this. Sophia let out a soft, humorless laugh. You think this is something you can just fix? His jaw clenched. I don't know, but I know I need to try. Sophia's heart ached at the desperation in his voice, but she forced herself to stay strong. And what if I don't want to try, Lucas? For the first time, she saw fear flash across his face. She expected him to argue, to push, to demand that she give him another chance. But instead, he nodded slowly, as if the reality of her words was sinking in. If that's what you want, he said quietly, then I won't stop you. Sophia's breath caught. She had expected a fight, she had prepared for one, but hearing him say it, he wouldn't stop her, made something inside her twist painfully. She clenched her fists under the table, trying to steady herself. Lucas watched her carefully. Is that what you want? She opened her mouth, ready to say yes, ready to walk away again, just like she had before. But the words wouldn't come, because the truth was, she didn't know. She had spent so much time convincing herself that leaving was the right choice, that moving on was the only option. But sitting here across from him, seeing the raw sincerity in his eyes, doubt crept in. Lucas saw it, and that was all the hope he needed. I won't rush you, he said softly. I won't ask for an answer tonight, but I'm not giving up, Sophia. She swallowed hard. Lucas, I love you. The words hit her like a thunderclap. She sucked in a breath, her entire body freezing. Lucas held her gaze, unwavering. I love you, he repeated. And I don't care if it took me too long to realize it. I don't care if I have to spend every day proving it to you, but I'm not going to pretend anymore. Sophia's heart pounded. Lucas Blackwood, the man who had once dismissed love as a weakness, was sitting across from her, laying his heart bare, and she had no idea what to do with it. She rose to her feet abruptly, needing air, needing space. I need to go. Lucas nodded, standing as well. Okay. She turned to leave, but before she could take a step, his voice stopped her. I'll wait for you, Sophia, however long it takes. She closed her eyes, exhaling shakily. Then, without another word, she walked away, leaving Lucas standing there watching her go. But this time, he wasn't letting her go for good. Section 10. Sophia barely remembered how she got back to her apartment. Her mind was a whirlwind, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Lucas Blackwood had just told her he loved her. I love you. The words played over and over in her head, unraveling every piece of logic she had so carefully built around herself. He hadn't just said it, he had meant it. She had seen it in his eyes, in the way his voice wavered with raw emotion, in the way he had promised to wait for her. And yet the walls she had built around her heart weren't so easily shattered. She had spent months convincing herself that she had moved on, that she was better off without him, that she was stronger now, independent, thriving in her own right. So why did she feel so lost? She sank onto her couch, staring blankly at the city lights outside her window. Lucas Blackwood had always been a mystery to her, a man who kept his emotions locked away, who never let anyone in. And yet, when he had finally opened up, when he had finally given her the one thing she had wanted all along, she had run. Was she really going to walk away from this? Her phone buzzed beside her, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. Catherine Whitfield. Sophia hesitated before answering. Hey, she said, her voice sounding distant even to herself. I heard you had dinner with Lucas, Catherine said without preamble. Sophia sighed, rubbing her temples. News travels fast. You know how these circles are, Catherine replied. Are you okay? Sophia hesitated. I don't know. Catherine was silent for a moment. Do you love him? Sophia closed her eyes. It doesn't matter. It does. Sophia exhaled shakily. Catherine, you saw how he was before, how he treated our marriage, how he planned to let me go the moment our contract ended. I did, Catherine admitted, but I also saw how he looked at you when you walked away, and I saw how lost he's been ever since. Sophia bit her lip, her chest tightening. You know what I think? Catherine continued. I think Lucas didn't realize what he had until he lost it, and now that he knows, he's willing to do whatever it takes to fix it. Sophia swallowed hard. And what if it's too late? That's your choice, Catherine said gently, but don't make it because you're scared. Make it because it's what you truly want. Sophia didn't respond, because she wasn't sure she had an answer. 3 days passed. 3 days of tossing and turning at night, 3 days of avoiding Lucas's calls, 3 days of trying to convince herself that walking away was the right choice. But deep down, she knew the truth. She loved him. She had always loved him, and maybe, just maybe, he loved her too. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, leaving her breathless. She couldn't keep running. Not from him, not from herself. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her keys and walked out the door. Lucas sat in his office, staring blankly at the financial reports on his desk. He hadn't slept properly in days, hadn't been able to focus on work, hadn't been able to do anything but think about Sophia. He had bared his soul to her, told her the truth he had spent so long denying, and she had walked away. Maybe he deserved that. Maybe he had pushed her too far, too many times. Maybe it was too late. He was about to pour himself a drink when the sound of his office door opening made him look up. And there she was, Sophia. His breath caught, his heart slamming against his ribs. For a moment he thought he was imagining her, but then she stepped forward, her eyes locking onto his, filled with something he couldn't quite place. Hope, fear, love. I couldn't stay away, she whispered. Lucas swallowed hard, slowly rising to his feet. Sophia, she took another step closer. You said you'd wait for me. His throat tightened. I meant it. She exhaled shakily. Then tell me the truth. No more walls. No more half-truths. Lucas held her gaze, his voice steady. I love you. I love you more than I ever thought I could love anyone. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you if you let me. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she was smiling. I don't need you to prove it, she murmured. I just need you to mean it. Lucas stepped forward, closing the distance between them. I do. And then, finally, he kissed her. It wasn't the kind of kiss they had shared before. It wasn't practiced. It wasn't for show. It was real, raw, full of everything they had been too afraid to say before. And in that moment, Sophia knew she had just found her forever. If you loved this story of passion, redemption, and true love, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Your support keeps these stories coming. Stay tuned for the next one. Stay tuned for the next one. Stay tuned for the next one.